My name is Gerard Porter, and I'm a lecturer in medical law and ethics at Edinburgh Law School, and I'm an associate with the Mason Institute for Medicine, the Life Sciences and the Law. And I'm here today with Dr. Mark Flear, who is going to talk about his recent research that discusses some of the issues around the EU policy to do with the offshoring of clinical trials and the use of clinical trial data. Mark, Dr. Flear, welcome. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and also your current research interests?
Well, I work at the School of Law at Queen's University, Belfast. I also sit on a DNA database governance board, the Northern Ireland DNA database governance board, so I have a bit of work on the regulatory side. And my research really focuses on the biopolitics of new health technologies and public health. So that's my focus. Now, when I say biopolitics, it has a quite particular meaning. It is essentially politics, the politics of the things that I mentioned, those two areas. But it's a term actually taken from Michel Foucault's work that highlights how life, bio, is very much central to the exercise of power, formally accountable power in particular. So the power exercised by states and the power exercised by the European Union. And it's the power exercised by the European Union that I'm interested in my research.
The paper that you're talking about today is focusing on offshored clinical trials. Can you tell us a little bit about the paper and how you got interested in this topic?
Well, the paper is part of a bigger project called Governing Public Health. It's my monograph. And so I needed... as part of that project, which is, as I say, on governing public health, I needed a case study or a series of case studies through which to advance particular arguments. One of which was that there are important normative questions to be asked about the way in which public health is being regulated at the European Union level. So I wanted to try to bring out normative questions in areas that are very technical, or seem very technical and very dry. So I looked at clinical trials. The reason, or more specific reason I looked at clinical trials is that the EU is or has a very important role to play in relation to pharmaceuticals. So within the EU's internal market, there are different ways in which market authorisation can be granted, but the EU plays a very critical role in that system, in those different ways in which market authorisation can be granted. More than that, the EU also regulates, to some extent, clinical trials. So there's a direct connection there between pharmaceuticals as being a key thing that the EU regulates and clinical trials, which are crucial to generating the data that then goes on to provide the basis for market authorisation of pharmaceuticals. So there's a connection there.
And in this research project and this paper, you've suggested that there's an infiltration of market-orientated ideas and values into formerly non-market domains like biomedical knowledge production and public health. Could you tell us a little bit more about what these ideas and values are?
One is that the system of market authorisation and clinical trials being aligned to that system and the criteria for market authorisation, which focus on quality and efficacy of pharmaceuticals, that's geared very much towards ultimately ensuring that pharmaceutical companies are able to become profitable, or more profitable than they are at the moment. They're in trouble at the moment for various reasons, one of which is that they haven't had so many blockbuster drugs, the drugs that make the money for them. And that is, of course, a concern. We all want a profitable pharmaceutical sector. It's very important for the economy. But that, within the EU's regulatory system, is, in my view, the core focus. That is the core focus, rather than public health. So, in that way, we can see that there is a very market-oriented focus, but it's a very particular kind of focus. It's to do with corporate profitability. Now, more than that, we can see market-oriented norms and values infiltrating biomedical knowledge creation in some more particular ways, or ways that might get missed. Biomedical knowledge creation is increasingly tied then to that system. More than that, it's tied to the exercise of the EU's power in this area, or the regulatory power in this area. So my view is then that biomedical knowledge actually services power in a sense. It services those regulatory aims, or in particular that regulatory aim of ensuring that corporations are able to make money, to be profitable, and so on. So that's one more specific way. Another more specific way in which we can see market-oriented values and norms infiltrating biomedical knowledge creation is in the focus on informed consent and good clinical practice as part of that which essentially authorises and validates the performance of clinical trials. And more than that, we see that through informed consent and the focus on informed consent and good clinical practice, there's a phrasing of the research subjects. They have to take responsibility. So this might seem quite an interesting notion, but when one actually gives informed consent to participate in a clinical trial, essentially that individual is being asked to carry some of the load, to take some responsibility, to say that he or she has listened to the information about risks and benefits, understands the information, and then can make that informed decision, that informed choice about whether or not to participate. But that's a phrasing of the individual with responsibility. And then on the other side, we see that the EU, as a regulator, its focus is very much on ensuring, as I've said, quality and efficacy of pharmaceuticals, ensured that pharmaceuticals are safe, that they can be authorised for sale within the EU's internal market. That's a limitation of responsibility on the side of the regulator. And then on the other side, we have the individual saying, I understand, I give my informed consent to participate. But for me, hopefully it makes sense to others, there's an imbalance there. I think the regulator ought to be doing more, and informed consent is absolutely vital, but I think that could be reformed so that the individual actually knows what's going to come of the data, essentially.
Do you think that there's a degree of tension between these market-oriented ideas and values and the goals of producing the kinds of medicines that society really needs and the goals of public health?
I think it's important to be clear. It's the way in which the system is at the moment. We do need pharmaceuticals. That's obvious. We need pharmaceuticals, but what we need are pharmaceuticals that aren't just more of the same, that are in fact genuinely innovative. Now, of course, it's very hard to fashion a system that can produce that can result in innovative pharmaceuticals. Innovation here could just mean the treatment of diseases of poverty, or making sure that people in the global south have that, have access to pharmaceuticals that will meet their needs.
So, in addition to thinking about the kinds of drugs that get produced under this system and whether they're really the drugs that society needs, is it also valuable to think about the ways in which the regulatory system could be reformed so as to enhance the protections for the participants in clinical trials?
Absolutely, yeah. Enhancing the protections is very important. So, before I could talk about enhancing the protections, I'll just kind of step back a little bit and think in terms of refashioning or redefining those criteria for market authorisation. So they focus very much at the moment on quality and efficacy, very important things. But what I think we really need is to focus on, well, are the benefits offered by this new pharmaceutical actually such that it compares with what we already have, and actually not just compared, it's better, it's a genuine innovation, that's part of it. More than that, is there a genuine need for the pharmaceutical? Is it just another of much the same, or is it genuinely innovative? And as I've said in the paper, innovation, it doesn't have to be big science, it can be very, much more modest. Treating diseases of poverty can be far more straightforward but requires some innovation in the regulatory regime, and that's what I've tried to emphasise in the paper. Now, in terms of ethical protections then, we're not really going to have that definition of the criteria for market authorisation in the immediate future. So in terms of ethical protection as well, the regulatory regime that we have does focus, as I've said, on informed consent and good clinical practice. The actual words, the definitions of those things in law are, I think, quite open. And it's for the European Medicines Agency to actually give more specific meaning to those terms. So I think what could happen is that the European Medicines Agency could and should be a bit more clear about informed consent as being not just the research subject being given information on risks and benefits and so on, but actually the research subject being told, well, is this trial, is it, if it produces data that leads to market authorisation, is it going to lead to genuine innovation? Is it actually going to do that? That can mean, is it going to lead to the treatment of diseases of poverty? That can be an innovation. Or it may not even be innovation in that sense, or in the way in which we usually understand it. Is the pharmaceutical just going to treat diseases of poverty? Is it going to meet a genuine need? Is it going to do that? I think the Medicines Agency could focus more on trying to ensure that informed consent takes into account that sort of information. In terms of the law is pretty open, and actually, arguably, the law encompasses this sort of information, but there's lots of research in anthropology and sociology that stresses that actually the sorts of information that's passed over to the research subject in that interview isn't necessarily the sorts of information that I've highlighted that I think they need in order to make that informed choice.
Your research is looking at the phenomenon of the offshoring of clinical trials.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about what this is and why it's happening?
Clinical trials abroad, or the offshoring of clinical trials, made famous by Petrinia, is occurring for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is that corporations, pharmaceutical corporations, well, they need to make money. That's what corporations need to do, isn't it? They are, however, experiencing problems doing that. It's becoming an awful lot harder for them to make profits, in particular because there are fewer blockbuster drugs than there used to be. So that's one key reason. Now, corporate profitability then drives the search for data that will, in the absence of significant innovation, actually demonstrate that new drugs, although not significantly innovative, are nevertheless safe and that they work. That data can be easier to produce in areas of the world that are essentially poorer, that have had less, historically speaking, access to pharmaceuticals. So in the West, we're very used to accessing pharmaceuticals. Our bodies are very much used to pharmaceuticals, so it can be harder when using research subjects that are used to pharmaceuticals to demonstrate that a new pharmaceutical actually works. It can be harder, scientifically speaking, to demonstrate. If, however, we go and use research subjects that haven't been exposed to pharmaceuticals in anywhere near the same kind of way as people living in the West, in particular, it can just be easier to demonstrate that a new drug works. Their bodies will just demonstrate far more straightforwardly that the new pharmaceutical works. So that's one reason why there's this drive. That's one driver, but it's also corporate profitability. There are other reasons why it's attractive to outsource or offshore or try to derive data from international clinical trial subjects. I think one reason, and I think this is a bit controversial, is simply that the people in the global south in particular don't have access to the same sorts of treatments that people do in the north, particularly in the west. Now this is controversial because people ought not to be exploited when they research subjects, but in the research, in the anthropological research and in the sociological research, those are the disciplines that have been generating insights into the performance of clinical trials abroad. We can see actually that costs, that individuals in vulnerable situations, individuals who don't have a choice really, they either don't have access or they get access to a clinical trial. These sorts of things actually are important to this trend, help to explain this trend.
So an EU-focused question is about the way forward, if you like, in changing policy or developing policy. So the EU is not a monolithic entity, it's got lots of different moving parts, and it's not simply trying to achieve one particular goal. It's obviously economic development, security, and these kind of things are important, but it's also self-consciously producing itself as an ethical actor in foreign policy and foreign affairs. To what extent do you think that this ethical dimension, or the idea that the EU is really compliant with human rights standards, might be a kind of useful kind of pressure point, if you like, for developing policy in this area as the years go by?
So the EU, as part of its identity, tries to construct itself as an ethical actor. I'm not going to say that the EU is not an ethical actor, but I think we need to query whether the EU is as ethical as it portrays itself to be. Now, the EU, in its regulatory system, focuses on ethics as a way to validate the market circulation of pharmaceuticals, to say these pharmaceuticals are ethical. But as I've said, the focus is very much on informed consent, good clinical practice. That's ethics, and it's a very limited notion of what's ethical. And I try to say that in the paper and in the talk. Now, this focus on ethics, on the EU as an ethical regulator, does, as you said, create a pressure point. Or, I'll use my own words, it creates a means for those who are clinical trial subjects, or those who campaign for access to medicines, an important part of which is the production of usable clinical trials data for diseases of poverty. Those sorts of individuals and groups, other individuals and groups, concerned individuals and groups, they can actually focus on ethics and say, well, actually, the EU isn't necessarily as ethical as it says it is, or there are problems with the current design of the system. Ethics are being framed in a certain way, they're being used in a certain way, and in a limited way. It's possible to focus on the problems with the system in order to essentially undermine or destabilise the EU's standing and its reputation. Now, again, I'm not trying to say that the EU is not ethical, but we should query whether what it does is as ethical as it says. My view is that there are some key concerns. A key way to try and get the EU to modify its regulatory regime, and so the EU is a monolithic, there are many moving parts, as you say, the European Commission, the European Medicines Agency, there are other institutions that might listen and might actually think, well, actually we're not as ethical, or the system isn't as ethical as it could be. So ethics then can put pressure on the EU. It can produce this risk to reputation, to standing. It can generate then an institutional risk, or a set of institutional risks that the EU, as a risk regulator, that's the focus of its regime, must do something about. It needs to do something about institutional risks as part of its role as a risk regulator.
So one feature of your work that I find really interesting is the fact that even though you're in a law school and have legal training, you're connecting to other disciplines as a way to understand the subject.
Right.
So you're using themes from anthropology, sociology, science and technology studies. why is it useful to use those themes and ideas to get a handle on what's going on? Why not just stick with a straightforward law approach?
Well, it's true. I'm not working straightforwardly within law, but then I suppose we might have a conversation about, well, what is legal scholarship? I think a focus on doctrine, if that's what most people might understand to be law or legal scholarship, isn't sufficient. What we need to do is try and understand the effects of the law. What is it doing or what is it not doing? What sorts of aims is it trying to achieve? Really? How do we understand the law? We should actually widen out a little bit, in my view, and try to understand the broader regulatory setting or the regime, the aims, the values, the priorities, how all of that is tied to efforts to produce socio-political order, the EU's project of integration. All of these things are linked and I think can explain how the law is, how it's being used, and its effects. Now, many of these things can't really be answered without looking at anthropology, sociology, science and technology studies. They are the disciplines that have actually done most of the work in revealing the effects of the law and actually underscoring or drawing attention to the way in which the law, so I've looked at a specific set of law, just a few legal rules, and actually that's connected to the EU's broader project, its project of rule, its effort to try and create something, its project of integration, and that can help us to explore and to explain the law and its effects. And we can only really see those effects when we, I think, when we look in some of the more vulnerable places in the world, and the sorts of disciplines that have drawn attention to those places are the ones I've mentioned. Now, there's a bit more to say, and that is that I think legal scholarship, so not to caricature legal scholarship, but I think legal scholarship doesn't tend to look at knowledge creation, at science necessarily, as something for law and lawyers to look at. Whereas actually, what I try and say in the paper, and the larger book that it's a part of, is that actually we need to be looking at science and technology as lawyers. We really need to be, because there are normative questions in science, in technology. And as lawyers, we're interested in normative questions. We ought not to be scared of science and technology. We ought not to step back and think, oh, the scientists will deal with that. That's to do with science and technology. It's for the scientists. Actually, it's also for the lawyers. Many other disciplines look into law and examine law, and law ought not to be shy about looking into other areas and, to put it shortly, bring out the normative in the technical.
Dr. Flear, thank you very much.